Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream of History Byte podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor John J. Collins, and today we'll be discussing the book of Daniel, when it was written, and the problems with its prophecy, why the prophecy failed, etc. So it's good to have you back on the show, John.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining me. So I'd like to start off with, who is Daniel, the alleged author of the book of Daniel, and what is the book about?
Well, if you read the book of Daniel, he is introduced as a young man who is taken prisoner from Jerusalem to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, so at the early part of the 6th century. But, certainly no critical scholar nowadays believes that Daniel actually existed. The name Daniel was already famous, apparently. It's mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, where he says, "Are you wiser than Daniel?" So he was evidently already a legendary wise man. There was a figure called Daniel who shows up in Ugaritic texts from the second millennium. Whether he has any connection with this Daniel, we really can't say. But the Daniel you read about in the book of Daniel is a fictitious character, and there are various stories about him, many of them of a folkloric nature, which you now get in Daniel chapters 2 to 6. And then what became the pseudonymous author of visions, dream visions, in the 2nd century BCE, in the time of the Maccabees, or less. So does that get us started?
Oh, I certainly think it does. What leads to the conclusion that there was no Daniel at all that existed? Could the book of Daniel just been simply attributed to somebody, some random person called Daniel that was later, these stories that we're talking about was simply just created around this person? Or is there no reason to really think that either?
I suppose there could have been. I don't think there's any definitive proof that nobody named Daniel existed. There surely did. There could well have been people named Daniel in the Babylonian exile. But a lot of the stories about him, are of a fantastic nature. Like Daniel in the lion's den seems like fairly blatant fiction. Equally, the story of Nebuchadnezzar's madness, that's one that we can actually trace now to some degree. It seems to have been originally a story about another king, Nabonidus, and gone through a process of transmission. So, there may have been a Daniel. There may have been a Daniel who was an interpreter of dreams. We don't know. We don't really have any solid historical evidence about him. It's a bit like saying that there may have been a real King Arthur, or that some of the characters in Homer may have existed. And they may have, but that's really beside the point. Now, what we can say with much more confidence is that the visions in the second half of the book were actually written several hundred years later than the Babylonian exile, because these are all preoccupied with the events of just about a year in the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so you would be left to wonder, why Daniel got all these revelations of a time a few hundred years after his own time, but, just in the middle of history, so to speak. So
is there... Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
My question about the Daniel that you mentioned earlier in the Ugaritic text. Is there any link between that Daniel in the sense that is it possible that he is the inspiration for creating the fictitious Daniel in any way that we see in the book,
Well,
or is it just a coincidence? They don't have anything to do with each other.
I don't see any connection, to be honest. Some people do. Some people think this must have been the Daniel, but I don't really see that there's any evidence for it. You
Mm.
a gap of almost 1,000 years in between, and not really any similarity in the character who is described. So, maybe that's where the name came from. Who knows? But we do have that reference in Ezekiel to Daniel as a legendary wise man. So there must have been stories about Daniel that we no longer have.
I want to go back to what you were mentioning about the visions. You were mentioning the visions in the book of Daniel are certainly hundreds of years later by the time it's talking about. Can you talk about that some more?
Well, this was figured out already in antiquity by a pagan philosopher named Porphyry, who noticed that in Daniel chapter 11, you have a very accurate prediction of events in the Hellenistic period. And if you now pick up an Oxford annotated Bible, you can see what all these references are. The king of the north is a king of Syria, the king of the south is a king of Egypt, and you can check off all the events down until the death of this evil king. And that this is the king who is transparently Antiochus Epiphanes, who tried to suppress the cult in Jerusalem. And then they have everything right about him until his death. They say that he will die between the sea and the holy mountain. And he didn't. He died off in the east in Persia. So Porphyry figured out that the reason that the prophecies were so accurate down to that point is that they were written after the fact. And that vision, at least, was written shortly before the death of Antiochus became known in Jerusalem. And that would account for how he knew everything up to a certain point and then didn't.
Right, and that would, I would presume that would be the reason why he got the death of Antiochus wrong.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can you talk about other problems with the historical information in the book of Daniel, particularly in your commentary on the book of Daniel? You talk about that it says something about Nebuchadnezzar laying siege on the third year of Jehoiakim's reign, and you talk about how that's very problematic.
Well, you have. Let me just get it here a second.
Sure.
I should have opened this beforehand. But, I think that's just a little bit of historical sloppiness.
Mm.
Because I think the authors really weren't too concerned with the precise historical details and were not trying to give an accurate account of history. So, he wants to set the events in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. So it wasn't in the third year of King Jehoiakim that he came up. And so but he just wants to give a date and a time and give the appearance of history without worrying too much about it.
Mm. Who is Daniel, son of man?
This is in Daniel chapter 7. Arguably the most famous vision in the book, one of the most famous visions in the whole Hebrew Bible. And in this, Daniel sees 4 great beasts coming up out of the sea, and it's like a nightmare. And then he sees one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. And that this has been interpreted in various ways. The problem with the vision is that a figure who comes riding on the clouds, elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, is always the God of Israel, Yahweh or Adonai. Now, in older Canaanite literature, it was the god Baal. In the Canaanite literature, then there was another god above Baal, El, who was a venerable ancient figure. And in Daniel 7, amazingly, there is an Ancient of Days who confers kingship on the Son of Man who comes on the clouds. Now, to say that he is one like a Son of Man just means that he looks like a human being. Now, that probably means he was not actually a human being. The other figures are beasts. Nothing is quite what it seems in an apocalyptic vision. And elsewhere throughout the book, even, you will meet later on the man Gabriel. When a figure appears who looks like a man, it's usually what we would call an angel or a heavenly figure. Now, there have been the main issues in the debate about the meaning of the Son of Man. In the Gospels, Jesus is identified as the Son of Man. And so for most Christian interpreters, for hundreds of years, this was taken as a prophecy of Jesus. Now, when people began to read the Bible in its historical context, it was clear enough it had to be something that people could possibly have understood at the time. And they couldn't have known about Jesus 200 years before Jesus lived. So that takes that one off the table. Now, for a long time, many people assumed that this was a corporate representation of Israel. And there is something to that because the four beasts all represent four kingdoms. And I think there is a sense in which the one like a Son of Man does represent Israel. But I think this is what I would call a mythic realistic symbol, that you can be a king represents his people. And in this case, the figure who represents Israel is identified for us later on in the book as Michael, your prince, as Daniel is told. So the archangel Michael, I think, is the most likely candidate. Now, from a fairly early time, this figure was interpreted as the Messiah. But you don't get a Messiah anywhere else in the book of Daniel. And, the figure who represents Israel on the heavenly level in Daniel is the Archangel Michael. And so that, I think, is who we're talking about here, or who Daniel was talking about.
What is Daniel's prophecy overall about? What is he expecting? And when does he think this prophecy was supposed to be fulfilled?
Well, we're fortunate in the case of Daniel that we have the books of Maccabees. And so we have a fair idea in plain prose of what was going on at the time. And that there are very clear references to this throughout the book of Daniel. It's a complicated issue. We could go into it if you want to, but it's probably a little bit too complicated and off the subject here. But Antiochus Epiphanes had been basically trying to get his hands on the money in the Jerusalem temple. And he changed the high priest for that purpose. And then when he was in Egypt at one point, fighting broke out between two rival claimants to the high priesthood in Jerusalem. And Antiochus took it that Jerusalem was in revolt and sent in the troops. And what he tried to do was say that Judah or Judea could no longer exist as a separate entity, as a distinct entity. And one of the ways of undermining the distinctive entity of Judea was to suppress the traditional cult. And according to the book of Daniel and also to First Maccabees, he installed something that was called the abomination of desolation. In Hebrew, that's shikutz meshomem. And in all likelihood, this was an altar dedicated to the Syrian god Baal Shamaim, and it's a pun. The Shikutz Meshomaim is a pun on Baal Shamaim. And now, from the viewpoint of Judeans, who were devoted to their traditional god, this was a total disaster, because it meant you couldn't atone for sin properly if the temple cult wasn't working. And that is really what caused the Maccabean revolt. I don't think Daniel was a wholehearted supporter of the Maccabean revolt, because Daniel thought that the Archangel Michael would do it for them, that God would intervene. And, the Maccabees had to compromise a little bit on the law. If you wanted to fight against the Seleucids, you had to break the law on the Sabbath by defending yourself. And so I think Daniel was hoping for a purer deliverance. But what he expected and hoped for was the death of the king. So then the end of this pollution of the temple. In other words, that the temple would be restored. Now, we know Judas Maccabee actually did restore the kingdom, restore the temple, but Daniel doesn't seem to think that did it, that satisfied it. Because at the end of the book, he tells you, that it will be so many days, and that he was still expecting a further deliverance. Now, one of the intriguing possibilities in it, because he mentions that when Michael would arise in victory, the dead would be raised. And so it is a possibility that the author of Daniel was actually expecting that kind of a miraculous transformation that would include the resurrection of the dead. And that, of course, didn't quite happen.
Can you tell us more about how do we know that Daniel discusses Antiochus IV Epiphanes?
Oh, you just read Daniel 7, and especially Daniel 11, in light of what we know from the books of Maccabees. This is Daniel 11:21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person on whom royal majesty hath not been conferred, and he shall act deceitfully, come into parts of the province, and he shall stir up his power and determination against the king of the south. Now, he invaded Egypt. And you have fairly transparent references to that, how the two kings would sit at one table and exchange lies. And then at the appointed time he shall return and come into the south, but this time it shall not be as it was before. And this time ships of the Kittim shall come against him. Now, we know that the Roman legate, Popilius Laenas, met with Antiochus on the beach at Alexandria and ordered him to withdraw from Egypt, and drew a circle around him in the sand and told him that he wanted his answer before he stepped out of that circle. And Antiochus was sometimes called Epiphanes, the madman, but he wasn't that big a fool. And when the Romans told him to get out of Egypt, he got out of Egypt. But then he took it out on Jerusalem on the way back, because of the frustration of being humiliated like that in Egypt. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. Now, again, if you read the books of Maccabees, you see that there were people who we call Hellenizers, people who were eager to update Jerusalem. They had a gymnasium, they practiced Greek customs, they wore the Greek hats, we're told in Second Maccabees. And these are the people, some people, according to the books of Maccabees, also disguised their circumcision. So this would be the violators of the covenant. And then forces from him shall profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. Now, that's also what you get in the books of Maccabees. This is the refrain really that runs through the visions of Daniel, is the disruption of the daily sacrifice that was supposed to be offered every morning and evening. So from all of that, I think it is pretty clear who he's talking about. You know, even
Is there
in
a
antiquity, some people recognize that. People like Jerome, who translated the book of Daniel into Latin, knew that he was talking about Antiochus. So did the people who translated the Bible into Syriac. Now, even though they thought this was a prophecy given by Daniel a few hundred years before, it's quite clear what it's about.
does the book of Daniel recycle older prophecies, older stories, and repurpose them at all, or is the stories in Daniel pretty unique?
I mean, he certainly recycles things. In a way, probably the most controversial thing that he recycles is I mentioned how in the old Ugaritic myths, the rider of the clouds was Baal. And so Daniel recycles that imagery of Baal and El. And I think the reason he does it was the Syrians were putting in a cult of Baal Shemaim, Baal of the heavens, in the temple in Jerusalem. And Daniel wanted to say the real rider of the clouds isn't Baal. It's Michael, the Prince of Israel. And the real El is Yahweh, the God of Israel. So that was one major thing that he recycles. Now, in Daniel chapter 9, there's a famous passage where he's reading from the book of Jeremiah, how Jerusalem would be desolate for 70 years. And Daniel figured, well, Jerusalem is still desolate and it's been more than 70 years. And then an angel explains to him, well, actually, that's 70 weeks of years. And that one is interesting because it's probably the first example we have of an explicit reinterpretation of a prophecy. And, the reinterpretation, it obviously is a reinterpretation. 70 years does not mean 70 weeks of years. But that's way of interpreting it that treats prophecy, as if it were coded language that had a hidden meaning that you have to discover. That became very widespread and popular in antiquity. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a whole set of commentaries called Pesharim that interpret prophecy that way, on the assumption that it's all coded language and that you don't take it literally on face value.
What is the difference between Daniel, Son of Man, and the New Testament Son of Man?
Oh, I think there's a huge difference because in the New Testament, this figure rises in victory over the beast. Now, it doesn't describe a battle, but this figure is awarded the kingship. And he's set in a context of rival claims to universal kingship. Now, in the New Testament, he is somebody who comes on the clouds to gather in the elect. What they have in common is that there is a judgment. Daniel 7 doesn't actually describe a judgment of human individuals, whereas in the New Testament, it does that. In between Daniel and the New Testament, in all probability, comes a book that we know from the book of Enoch, which is preserved in Ethiopic. Some parts of it are preserved in Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but this part isn't. But in that, there is a figure who is called that Son of Man. And this is obviously, again, meant to be the figure that Daniel saw. Now, in the book of Enoch, I think he's a separate figure. He's a higher angel, even above Michael. But he also sits on the throne of glory to preside over the judgment. And that's something that you find Jesus also does then in the Gospel of Matthew. So I think, there had been some development of the idea of the Son of Man. There had been reflection on it before the Gospels were written, in the time between Daniel and the Gospels.
Some Christians would try to look at Daniel, and they'll say that if you look at the chronology of when it talks about the weeks that you were talking about earlier, that they'll claim that it lines up with the time of Pontius Pilate, and that it makes that it aligns Jesus with Daniel prophecy. They'll make connections like that in
That
their
takes some fancy
reinterpretation.
arithmetic. I mean, if you 490 years, if Daniel, he's supposed to have had that revelation in the first year of Darius, but there was no Darius the Mede. But if you had it at any time in the Persian period, now you come down, this would probably bring you down to the 1st century BC, but nobody in antiquity was actually keeping track. Nobody in ancient Judaism seems to have known how long the Persian Empire lasted, or just how much time had passed since the time of Daniel. So, no, I don't think, though, that there is, you'd need to do very fancy arithmetic on it to get that to fit the time of Pontius Pilate.
They also try to conflate the way that they try to conflate the Son of Man and Daniel, and obviously they assume that that's Jesus because Jesus is the Son of Man according to the Gospels. And then they assume that the Son of Man and Daniel is therefore the Messiah, the Old Testament Messiah, that they're all the same character.
Well, you see, that already in the similitudes of Enoch, that Son of Man is called a Messiah. Even though he doesn't act like one, he never actually comes on earth. But he is, they apply to him Psalm 2, where the Lord addresses the king as my Messiah or my anointed one. So the idea that this figure was the Messiah was one that was current. I think the authors of the Gospels probably would have agreed with that the Son of Man was the Messiah. But this was, again, part of the history of interpretation of it.
So the Son of Man in Daniel was not originally intended to be the Messiah.
No, but now, again, let me just clarify a little bit here. The traditional Messiah was somebody who would restore the kingship in Judah. So he was somebody who should come on earth and establish a kingship, drive out the foreigners, and reign as king. Now, we get references to such a figure in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we get them in a text called the Psalms of Solomon, written a little bit before the time of Christ. And then we get it in some of the later apocalypses like 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch. But, he is meant to be somebody who restores a kingdom on earth. Now, the Son of Man in Daniel doesn't do that. Doesn't seem to have that. There doesn't seem to be any interest at that point in restoring a kingdom on earth. But as the tradition goes on, they tend to conflate figures. It's a way of kind of tidying up the data, if you like. It's easier keep track of a smaller number of figures, and they tend to identify different figures that way. In 4th Ezra, this figure, very much like the Son of Man riding in the clouds, comes up out of the sea, and he is quite obviously then modeled on the Davidic Messiah. But that isn't the case in Daniel itself.
So are the Gospels aware of either the same kind of literature or similar literature, and they're developing a further developed version of the Son of Man, and they're incorporating that new framework of the Son of Man into their own?
Yes, now, I think a lot of the tradition may have been oral. We get, the literature that we have from that period is very much hit and miss. The book of Daniel itself was the latest book that was incorporated into the Hebrew Bible. Now, you had other books then, like the books of Maccabees, that were written after that and were accepted by some people as scripture, but not by all, and weren't part of the Hebrew Bible. Now, the similitudes of Enoch have been quite controversial. Some people don't want to accept them as being Jewish at all, because we only find them in Christian manuscripts in the Middle Ages. But I think they almost certainly were. It really was a Jewish text, because I think it's inconceivable that a Christian writing in the Middle Ages would have referred to a figure called that Son of Man and not indicated that it was Jesus. Not indicated or implied in any way that it was Jesus. So I think that really was a stage in the interpretation of Daniel that had come in between Daniel and the Gospels. I think the author of the Gospel of Matthew probably knew the similitudes, because he uses the same expression about the Son of Man sitting on the throne of glory, or the glorious throne. Now, we also have a text from Qumran of a figure who is called Son of God that has a lot of echoes of Daniel 7. Uses some of the same words. It doesn't have the full imagery now. It's not at all an explicit interpretation of it. But the fact that you have words very close to that text that was found at Qumran in the Gospel of Luke. These don't pertain to the Son of Man directly. They're in the Nativity account in the Gospel of Luke. And so my guess is that the author of Luke either knew this text or something very like it, or an oral tradition that was very like it. But it's often very hard to prove that kind of thing because our sources are so spotty.
Do we know what the historical Jesus thought about the book of Daniel?
We don't know what the historical Jesus thought about anything. I'd say, in a nutshell, I mean, there are lots of people who think they know, but they generally think different things. So, you might say that the mistake Jesus made was that he didn't write his own gospel, which might have cleared up a lot of ambiguity, but then it would have given New Testament scholars much less to work with. No, but to reformulate your question, maybe, what did the authors of the Gospels think of the book of Daniel? And that, I think, is simple enough. And, in all probability, Jesus thought something similar. And that is that Daniel was a prophet. I think it's quite clear that they thought that Daniel 7, talking about one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven, that was referring to an individual. It wasn't a corporate symbol for Israel or anybody else. It was referring to an individual. What we don't know, and what's enormously disputed, is whether Jesus thought he was the figure prophesied by Daniel. The authors of the Gospels clearly thought Jesus was the figure who was prophesied. I think one can make a good argument that Jesus thought that he was not. would thought that the Son of Man was somebody else. But while you can make an argument about that, it's never decisive. You can't prove it. One has a hunch one way or the other. But that's as far as it goes. That gets into another big convoluted issue, and that's, whether Jesus was expecting what we call the apocalypse, whether he was expecting, the heavens to open and divine forces to come down and change the earth and the dead to be raised. Now, that's the Gospels all predict that. Did Jesus? That's much harder to say.
So I'm gonna take some super chat questions. Israelite Christianity, thank you for your super chat. What are the exegetical problems associated with identifying the king of the north, spoken of in Daniel 11:36-45, as Antiochus IV?
Well, in 11, where are we here? The king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god. He shall pay no respects to the gods of his ancestors. That's relating to the fact that he was claiming to be Zeus made manifest. This much of it, I think, applies to Antiochus Epiphanes well enough. But then, beginning in verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. Now, but this didn't happen. It didn't happen that the Ptolemy of Egypt came and attacked Antiochus Epiphanes. And the king of the north shall rush upon him with many ships and shall come into the beautiful land. The beautiful land is obviously meant to be Israel. And it says then that he shall die between the sea and the holy mountain. He shall come to his end. And again, that didn't happen. We know that Antiochus Epiphanes died off in the east, but not in the land of Israel. So, that's the crucial problem of identifying him with Antiochus Epiphanes at that point. Now, when I say, did the author of Daniel mean Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, I think he probably did. He has meant the king of the north that he had been talking about right up to this point clearly fits Antiochus Epiphanes. The problem is that then he goes off script in the last bit and gives an account of the death of the king that doesn't correspond to what we know from other sources. Now, does that answer?
Israelite Christianity, think. Yeah, I thought you did. Let's take a look at the next one.
I'm sure it would take longer than we want to spend here to find out why you think it was Tigranes of Armenia. But if you can make a case for it, you should make it somewhere.
He's got a few more super chats. We'll just take a look at real fast. He's just going on about Tigranes there, so I guess we can breeze past that.
Yeah.
Evergreen.
As far as I am aware, Tigranes of Armenia had no contact with Judea. So I don't think anything that you were reading would fit the king of Armenia, but be that as it may. Dr. Hurtado, I presume that means the late Larry Hurtado, was a fine scholar, says Son of Man is divine. Yeah, okay. You see, this depends on what you mean by divinity. But I think throughout the Hebrew Bible, throughout ancient literature, a figure who is riding on the clouds. This is before the invention of the aeroplane. So a figure riding on the clouds is assumed to be a heavenly figure, not a human being. Now, if you call that divine, fine. Where ambiguity comes into it is that, in modern Judaism and Christianity, people tend to think of divinity as one God, as one supreme God. And Dr. Hurtado didn't mean that the Son of Man was the supreme God. There's a young man writing a dissertation at Brown University at the moment, arguing that there was no such thing as monotheism in ancient Judaism. Now, if by monotheism you mean that only one God existed, then he is certainly right. If you took that to mean that there is no one supreme God, then he wouldn't be right. But what we call angels are often called gods in antiquity. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're called gods, Elohim. There is a Greek Jewish text from around the turn of the era that says that when people die, they become gods. So, if by God you mean what many people call an angel, yes, then the Son of Man, I think, was a god. Small g.
I fished and thank you for your super chat. Josephus attributes a revolt 6670 to prophecy with destruction of Jerusalem and temple. Wasn't this the end of an age? Still no temple for 2,000 years?
Well, it was the end of an era, you could well say. Now, it wasn't followed by the resurrection of the dead, as far as I know, unless we missed it. And unless we are among the left behind. So, it was the end of an era, but I think Daniel was expecting something much more definitive than that. And of course, he was also expecting that all the kingdom under heaven would be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High, by which he meant the Jewish people. And that hasn't happened yet. Some people may be working on it.
Who do you think Daniel's Son of Man is derived from? What kind of text do you think the author, Daniel, whoever that person was, that gave him the concept of the Son of Man?
Oh, I think, the texts that kind of fit that combination of imagery best are the old Ugaritic texts, which were from a time more than 1,000 years before Daniel. Now, Daniel surely didn't have those particular texts, but the tradition that you find in those texts was still alive. And as I mentioned before, Antiochus evidently set up a cult of Baal Shemaim in Jerusalem, a cult of Baal. And so my guess is that the author of Daniel was familiar with some oral version of the story of Baal as rider of the clouds, who was given the kingship by El, who was the higher god. And that's kind of the idea that you have in Daniel 7, is the higher God, Yahweh, confers the kingship on the one like a Son of Man who comes riding on the clouds. And then as I read Daniel, that's clarified in chapters 10 through 12, where Michael is called the Prince of Israel.
So basically, what you're suggesting is something that's basically the Son of Man is the inspiration for creating the Son of Man is based on Baal.
Yes, in a way, but it's how would I put it? You get, if you've ever read any post-colonialism, you find a lot of this, where people take over the rhetoric and ideology of the colonial power and invert it or subvert it in some way. And I think this is common enough. I think you get things like this also in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, for example, where they will take over like the myth of the birth of Apollo and use that to describe the birth of Jesus. Not in historical terms, but just as imagery for it. So, I think while it's derived from the cult of Baal, it's really to subvert the cult of Baal. It's saying that the real rider on the clouds isn't Baal. It's our guy.
So basically, the Son of Man, is it supposed to be a different form of God or being subordinate to God? But
It's a being subordinate to God.
Mhm.
I don't think it's a hypostasis, as we would say. It's a figure like the Messiah, but really more an angel in this case. Now, somebody referred to Larry Hurtado. He wrote a lot on on what he called ditheism or binitarianism. The idea of a second power under God. And that there was some controversy about this already in antiquity. Now, in the similitudes of Enoch, that this is very clear. You have a second power, definitely under God, not on a power with the Most High, but above everybody else. And I think, you see, some of this was based on the analogy of the imperial court, where the emperor might have his right-hand man or a delegate, or in some kingdoms you might have that. And that's how they imagined the rule of God.
So why was the book of Daniel written? What was the author trying to accomplish when writing this text? What was the purpose?
The author, first of all, the author was trying to give people hope in a situation where the temple had been taken over. Now, for many Jews of the time, your whole welfare depends on the temple. If you can't atone for sin, you're in deep trouble. So this is a very distressing situation for them. So Daniel is telling them to hang in there. Now, one possible thing that some people did is do what the king tells you to do. Offer sacrifices to pagan gods. Participate in the festival of Dionysus. And we know that Antiochus tried a lot of that to try to just distract them from their traditional cult and accept the pagan cult instead. So Daniel doesn't want them to do that. And he's telling them, be patient, hang in there, even if you get killed. Because he says, when Michael prevails, the dead will be raised. Some people will rise and shine like the stars, and some people will rise to everlasting shame and contempt. Now, this is the only case in the Hebrew Bible, really, where you have the promise of a judgment of the dead. And it had probably come into Judaism just a little bit before that, in some of the books of Enoch, or a little bit earlier. But this was a novelty at the time. And, I think this was, it comes up in Daniel chapter 12. It's kind of the punchline of the book at the end, is that there will be this resurrection. Now, you see, if you believe that and believe in it seriously, it changes everything. It changes all your values. It's no longer important whether you live a long life or whether you see your children and your children's children even. What's important is whether you will get to go up to heaven to be with the angels after you die. And that's the message of Daniel.
So I just want to tell everybody to go get John J. Collins' commentary on the book of Daniel. I have the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below, and it will be in the pinned comment. And that being said, thank you for joining me today, John J. Collins.
Very welcome.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.